the CKA exam is a really challenging exam, and it's pretty much extensively hands-on. So this course was really designed to address all the objectives that you're going to run into on the exam. The course itself was devised into 13 specific sections. Mainly 2 to 12 will be the content, where we have the overview and then the closeout will be 1 and 13. Basically, we'll talk about the core concepts to make sure that we have an idea of etcd and what exactly is, for example, the process to install kubectl and just some of the real basics. Then we'll get into how to install Kubernetes and what are the options for that. We'll talk about clusters and nodes and what we need to do to access our Kubernetes cluster. We'll talk about deployments, talk about storage as well and what are the options. Networking and security will be covered. Managing our Kubernetes deployments and clusters is very important. And we'll talk about the tasks that we'll likely need to do there. And then monitoring and troubleshooting. How do we deal with, for example, an outage? Or how do we deal with a cluster node going down, right? These are the things that we want to address. Now, Module 12 is going to be comprised of different practice exams. These exams, I'll go through a scenario with you and then walk you through the solution. It's pretty much what they're devised out of. The exam itself is going to give you a scenario, and you'll need to go find the right syntax, the right command, and also steps, for that matter, of different commands to solve whatever the question is asking you to solve. And then we have the course closeout. Before we get started, let's do a quick introduction to your instructor. My name is Joseph Holbrook, and I'm the CLO of Tech Commanders. I've been in the IT industry for well over 25 years. I'm a highly certified and well-documented book and course author. And I'm really excited to be working with you today to walk through perhaps the most exciting certification in the world of IT at the time of writing the course. So with that said, I've got courses and books, as well as certifications that I hold from Google Cloud, AWS, of course the CKA, and of course the Linux Foundation as well. Now, when it comes to understanding, for example, the difference between the CKA and CKAD, I'll be walking through that as well. Now, as far as the learning reinforcements, this course is heavily based on demos. What I mean by demos is I'm going to be walking you through different steps to basically deploy a cluster, to bring up basically the etcd database, or to basically integrate other services and how to set up high availability, you name it. Everything will be walked through. I'll also be going through a Minikube demo as well. Now, Minikube, of course, is an excellent free tool that we could use in the world of DevOps to basically practice on and test and bring up a single node cluster. Now, for this exam, though, to be honest, Minikube probably won't be the best thing you'll want to practice on. You'll want to have at least a 4 or 5 node cluster set up and running. I'll talk about that and walk you through some different options there. We'll go through whiteboard discussions. I'll provide you documentation links. And then we'll also get through some practice questions and flashcards as well. Let's go ahead now and move on to the next lesson. Welcome to Module 2. In this module, we want to get to know what the CKA exam is all about. We want to talk about why we want to take the exam, and then talk about the domains, what exactly will be tested around. And then we'll go into some of the core concepts that we hopefully have already learned, but we want to touch on these just in case as a refresher. For example, what is Kubernetes? What is a container? What is Docker? Talk about some of the terminology that'll constantly come up on the exam. We'll also talk about the components that we'll need to know as well. And then I'll talk about the documentation And then I'll walk through Kubernetes via a whiteboard discussion as well. So that'll be this module here. We have a lot to cover. Let's go ahead and get started. Let's go ahead and get to know the exam in better detail. Now, the exam itself is, of course, known as the CKA exam, which in turn is the Certified Kubernetes Administrator exam. This was created by the Cloud Native Computing Foundation in collaboration with the Linux Foundation. So when we take the exam, we're actually going to register via the Linux Foundation and take it with their proctors. The purpose of the exam itself is to validate that you have the skills, basically, the competency of managing a Kubernetes environment, basically. Now, the CKA exam itself is a very challenging exam, and the reason is because it is an adaptive or performance-based test that is hands-on. In other words, you're going to get a scenario, and you'll need to know where to find the commands. So you'll have to look in the documentation, and then you'll have to go and take those commands that you found and run them in the simulator effectively in the exam. Now, the number of questions is 24 questions. That's the maximum number of questions. Now, the questions can be anywhere from 17 to 24. I think a lot of it just depends on how well you do. But basically, the maximum number of questions is 24, at least at the time of writing. So it is 100% hands-on, meaning that there's no multiple choice, there's no guessing. You'll have to type in the exact syntaxes, and you'll get graded based on those syntaxes. It is really the benchmark for Kubernetes expertise. So when you pass this exam, rest assured you'll be quite accomplished. Now, I'll talk about the exam logistics, like how you sign up, the exam experience, at the end of the course, just so that we could focus on basically preparing for the exam at this point. With that said, let us proceed to the next lesson. Why get certified? Well, when it comes to getting certifications in the world of IT, the CKA is certainly one of those exams that stands out. The demand is, of course, skyrocketing with Kubernetes. Companies are now requiring skills in Kubernetes as well. And just as an example, and there's several of these examples, but basically the average pay is about $144,000 for someone that has the CKA certification. So it's not a bad salary when it comes to getting certified and actually passing the CKA exam. Now also too, career advancement, job security, these are just some of the many reasons to get certified. Also too, you want to be on the leading edge, you want to get certified in cloud native. It's a great way to do it. Lastly, it proves that you have hands-on skills. So the exam, of course, we know is performance-based. It's very challenging, and if you're able to pass it, it's not like passing an AWS exam. It's not like passing a Google Cloud exam where you can, get through the multiple choice questions. This is going to be one of those exams where if you pass it, you absolutely know what you're doing. So with that said, let's go ahead and move on to the next lesson. What is Kubernetes? Now, Kubernetes, as we may be aware of, is a container orchestration platform. Now, effectively, if you talk to 10 different people, you'll get 10 different answers about what Kubernetes is. So the most simple definition of Kubernetes is that it's a container orchestration tool that can be run on Linux or Windows, for example. Now, it is free and open source. In other words, there's no license fees to pay. It's available for everybody to use. It is the leader when it comes to deploying containers effectively and orchestrating container rollouts. Basically, we're going to use this for our CI/CD pipelines. And when it comes to Kubernetes, we can deploy this on-prem or in the cloud as well. That's important to be aware of. Now, the architecture of Kubernetes is basically a cluster scenario where, again, in this diagram here, we have multiple nodes effectively deployed. And then we have other components, which we'll talk about throughout the course in more detail. Now, when it comes to Kubernetes, again, we have a lot of terms to remember. We'll go through some of the terms. But again, when it comes to memorizing terminology, we're going to need to know that for the exam. So if we're asked about how do we go ahead and back up etcd, we should know what etcd is, right? These are just some of the simple things. Or, kubectl, what is, the syntax we would use, right? So we need to reference that immediately on the exam. But again, the exam is not going to test you on terminology. It's just that we're going to need to know the terminology to get through the exam. Now, when it comes to the architecture of Kubernetes, remember it's a cluster deployment. Typically, we could deploy a single node if we wanted to, but again, to get the benefits out of Kubernetes, we want to have, of course, a cluster with multiple nodes. Now, when we deploy Kubernetes, remember too that we have pods. The pods are hosted where they're hosted on the nodes. And then we have on each node, we have kube, as I like to call it for short, or kubelet running. So when it comes to Kubernetes, again, there's a lot of parts and pieces that we have to get to know. Now, when it comes to understanding Kubernetes and the components, there's so many components. We'll go through these components throughout the core part of the course. But when we get into the CKA domains, we're going to sort of expect you to know a lot of these terms. We won't be explaining them due to the length of the course. And I do encourage anyone that is not really comfortable with Kubernetes to go and take the Fundamentals Kubernetes course that hopefully is available on this platform as well, to really get a deeper understanding of all the different components. So with that said, just be aware there's many different components. We're going to need to know how to tie in these components for the exam. Now, when we think about components, we have basically three main parts. We have the control plane, we have the nodes, and then we have pods. So in the world of Kubernetes, it's mainly focused on nodes and pods. But remember, there is a control plane, right? We have to have a master node. We have to have, for example, a way to communicate with other nodes, right? This is basically the purpose of breaking down the components. Lastly, Kubernetes is a container orchestration system for containers. It is meant to coordinate clusters of nodes to scale in production at an efficient manner. Also, as we may be aware of too, Kubernetes is known as K8 as well. That's all that I had for this lesson. Let's move on.